Salvador, Bukele has been in power for a couple of years now. And I know, at least the circles that I know, he's wildly unpopular. But at the same time, at the other circles, many people who I don't know would say he is a popular president right now because he has ushered in a new mode of, let's say, young modern leadership by making cryptocurrency, Bitcoin in particular, legal tender in El Salvador. He's managed to almost halve the violent
Homicide.
crime and murder rate in his country. How would you, so far, a couple of years in, judge his presidency?
When we talk about Bukele, we have to begin by talking about the contradictions, the dialectics. I was looking for a historical parallel to understand what's happening right now in El Salvador, and I think it's difficult to find one. We're talking about a country where over a third of the population of 6.4 million survives on less than $5 a day. And what existed in El Salvador pre-Bukele was a nation under siege by the Maras, these armies of gangs. Now, of course, we understand that these mostly young people, but also older people who are part of this parallel state, it wasn't their fault. It wasn't their choice. But the point is now for well over a decade, there's been 70,000 plus gang members who controlled San Salvador, Usulután, other major cities of El Salvador. And it's been very, very, very popular. We can't lie about this. Bukele's floated approval rates as high as 92%. Experts now are saying 76 to 86% of Salvadorians support his all-out war, a total war on these gangs. Since March of this year, in March, there was a particularly gnarly slate of gang murders. Since March, 2% of the entire population of El Salvador have been arrested. Over 100,000 people have been caught up in this dragnet. So it is incredibly controversial. It has trounced upon the human rights of the everyday people. But one can't deny that for the first time, the Salvadorian people feel like they're not living under these extortion rackets. They're not caught up in this horizontal warfare. So again, when we talk about El Salvador, we're talking about these deep-rooted contradictions.
Yeah, that's a very good point on the contradiction, because normally when we have these type of discussions, especially in Bukele's case, because it was just in March where he asked Congress to suspend certain constitutional rights in order to combat the gangs. So there's an acknowledgement of the suspension of constitutional rights, which people would, normally argue, make a humanitarian argument against, but at the same time, there doesn't, and as you said, his popularity on the street, is it really, can we really sum that up as is really his response to like the arrest of gang members? Because I was thinking they were saying about 60 or so thousand or people have been arrested. So is it just really the response to the violence that people feel better about him? Yeah, especially when you're talking about suspending constitutional rights.
It's like 2% of the adult population have been arrested under Bukele.
Yeah, it says between January and the end of October, 463 people were killed in El Salvador, a 50% drop compared to the same period last year.
Right.
It's probably that. I mean, I'm not saying the arrests are great, but like you said, it's somewhat of a contradiction. It's like, how do you bring... Let me ask you this. What is the country under normal circumstances? Meaning, because I guess there needs to be, some understanding of what people are living through for them to be okay with the policy that he's going through that's curtailing human rights.
Yeah, I just returned from Rio de Janeiro, where I was living in Brazil for the Brazilian elections. And I think there's an important parallel that we should study in Rio de Janeiro. When you go up into those favelas, it's gangs. It's a parallel society. Gangs control everything. They walk freely with their guns. They have complete hegemony. And that's how it was in El Salvador. And it's only now, for the first time, and the people themselves are participating. The people themselves are saying, we're sick of the extortion rackets. Street vendors are emblazoning this new culture where they come out and actually make citizens arrests, and they hold these young gang members, mostly youth. I mean, the life expectancy of one of these gang members, whether they're in the Mara Salvatrucha or the rival gang, the Barrio 18, Barrio 18, these two gangs are at war with one another. There's a rise in right-wing paramilitaries. Of course, the police constitute, the militarized police constitute their own gang. And this is what I was seeing in Rio de Janeiro as well. Let's take a step back. Let's look at the different articles of the Constitution that Bukele has passed. And nobody in his security cabinet, nobody in Congress, or very few people at that. I mean, even the Frente, el FMLN, the main leftist opposition has supported a lot of Bukele's articles. So he's implementing this security state. The articles he suspended in the Constitution: Article 7, suspended freedom of association. Article 12, the right to a defense attorney, suspended. Article 13, the time limit of 72 hours for administrative detentions, also suspended. And the final one, Article 24, the inviolability of communications. So this is a completely new regime, and it is quite popular. Of course, the main critique has to be, what is Bukele actually doing in an economic sense to provide alternative opportunities for these young people who are certainly not born gangbangers, but because of the particular nuanced national history of El Salvador, the all-out U.S. war against the leftist forces from 1979 to 1972, the migration patterns to L.A., the arbitrary deportations from Los Angeles of leading members of these gangs, that's what's created this hotbed in El Salvador that resulted in this situation.
Yes, and it's interesting when you think about it, because there is a parallel. I'm thinking about the 1993 crime bill that not just Joe Biden supported, many other people, civil rights leaders, they supported this. And now we're seeing that many of those things, the policies that were implemented, some were constitutional. There's a whole larger debate. Ruled unconstitutional. And there's a much larger debate that we can have about stop and frisk and what is and what isn't stop and frisk. But it seems as if there's something to this notion of, when it comes to security, that people are willing to forego certain liberties in order to keep themselves, or at least feel safe. And it seems as if that's something that's happening, seems like that's a similar thing that's happening in El Salvador. People they may not love the suspension of constitutional liberty, but at the same time, they're not protesting against it because it's a safety issue for them. And it's an interesting juxtaposition when you think about the United States' own history of this. Mike Bloomberg, what was in 2020, his speech, that Aspen speech that he gave in 2015, where not only does he justifies the stop and frisk policies, but he actually says in the speech, this is why we do it, because that's where the guns are found. So we throw them up against the wall and frisk them.
90% completely innocent,
because that's where the guns are found. But what are your thoughts on that, Danny? I do think that it is an interesting parallel to us in the United States willing to forego certain liberties in order to feel safe.
I appreciate you bringing up New York City, where I am and where I cut my teeth as an activist, as an organizer, as an anti-imperialist. We had campaigns in the Bloomberg years in Brownsville, where Mike Tyson is from, in Brooklyn, and Riddick Bowe. And half of the community, of course, hated the police, hated the stops and frisks. Now, the stops and frisks, that comes from the Giuliani era. I think we should actually that's the historical parallel that I saw between Bukele and Rudolph Giuliani. So we had these campaigns against the police, against police brutality in Brownsville, in the South Bronx. And, of course, most of the community hated the police and resented all of the humiliation and the stops and frisks. And in Bloomberg times, it was called the broken windows policy. So many people caught up in the system because of public urination or having an open container of alcohol. But the rest of the community, we can't deny, they believed in these dragnets, even if there were human rights violations, because the neighborhood felt terrorized. And that's what sparked this coming back to El Salvador. In March, there were also a series of murders of everyday commuters, everyday workers who were going to the markets, who were going to public transportation, and they were very randomly killed. El Salvador had this distinction. Again, we're talking about a small country of some 6 million people. I mean, we're basically talking about the population of Brooklyn here. There was one body per hour. There were 30 bodies per day. Bodies and bodies and bodies just stacking up. And if you look at the homicide rate, which was the highest in the world, in 2021, it was already down to 1,147. And then last year, it was halved again to 495. So the numbers don't lie in this sense. Now, of course, there is extremism, and there is all types of human rights violations. In the 9 months of the state of exception, which continually has been renewed some 6 times now, there's been over 61,000 arrests. At this point, 3,300 freed. But again, we can't get away from this contradiction that Bukele has been widely popular, young. He's only 41 years old, very polished image on social media, very untraditional image. If we study his speeches, I don't think we can say that there's a historical parallel that really lines up. He's by no means a Marxist. I don't think we can call him a right wing. He's in a war of words with the United States on Twitter. He calls out the United States at certain moments as if he was Hugo Chavez. And some people on the left could hate me for making these comparisons, but I defy them to prove that I'm wrong.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I'm curious for something like this. Because I think he gets stuck in a situation that many leaders get stuck into. Okay, what do we have to do for security? It becomes that issue. And I guess, how do you dance between the raindrops on this? Meaning, how do you allow people to basically have this kind of open society while simultaneously having those people getting killed in that open society and not do anything as the government? I mean, or for that matter, has there even been any kind of indication on how he's going to thread this back to some level of normality? Or this is just this way for the foreseeable future?
Well, to add to this lack of normality, Warren Buffett has donated some $25 million to the militarized police. And then what does Bukele do? He pivots to the Chinese. And he struck deals with the Chinese, and the Chinese have come in with their investment in a new soccer stadium, water treatment plants. So Bukele is speaking to this rise of multipolarity in the world. I don't think anyone could accuse him of being any type of pawn of the United States. In fact, both mostly the liberal wing of the ruling class has been highly critical of Bukele and the Biden White House. But I'm sure many people who come out of the Trump camp and the Republican camp and that get tough on crime camp, which has been one of the staples of the Republican Party that dates back to the Reagan years. That was really the rise of Reagan in 1980, to get tough on crime. And that's what Nixon used to win the presidency in the 70s. Of course, there's many admirers of Bukele in the Republican camp. Bukele has also used these humiliating tactics when he rounds up the gang members, of having them paraded through the streets naked, having them taken to the public square for the citizens to burlarse de ellos, to make fun of them. So I think we have to continue to comb through history and to understand this moment. And when has something like this occurred before, where there was a parallel society, total gang surveillance, and unless somebody perhaps lived in California, in South Central, in Compton, in Long Beach in the 1980s or 90s, or if someone's lived in Rio de Janeiro or lived in San Salvador, I don't think they can really appreciate this moment. Bringing us back to the 1990s, I was mentored by a lot of former young lords and Black Panthers, and I remember the Black Panthers schooling me and saying in the early 1990s, the homicide rate in the Black community, now this was never Black-on-Black violence, it was oppressed-on-oppressed violence. It was the most forgotten, the most spat upon, the most cast away of society, the horizontal violence that resulted from all these oppressive structures. And what we saw in the 1990s, the numbers, 10,000 Black men on average were being taken out, assassinated, murdered by 10,000 Black men. And when you tally that up, you're talking 20,000 young African-American men removed, erased from society every year. And that's what we're seeing in El Salvador. We're seeing masked police seized upon these different oppressed communities. But the problem is, in the jails, there's no social programs. There's no reintegration programs. We're talking about upwards towards some 100,000 people just completely disappeared now in Salvadorian society. So, of course, all of the human rights violations are there. People should study Claudia Ortiz. She's the main FMLN diputada or senator who's raising all of these concerns within Salvadorian parliamentary system. Claudia Ortiz. Check her out on Twitter.
Well, Danny, during the Trump years is 2019, it would be when Nayib Bukele was elected to the presidency. So he was very young. He's still in his 30s at that time. Like you said, he's in his early 40s now. He was like 39 when he was elected or something. So I think it's important to point out that era of the 1980s, as you said, of what he would have grown up watching, right, happening in El Salvador, and more broadly, the Northern Triangle is what they're called, right, in Central America, which includes Guatemala and Honduras. Now, I'm going to read a little introduction part from a congressional report from last April of 2022. And this is just an excerpt. It says, during the 1980s, the U.S. government spent billions of dollars to support the Salvadorian government's counterinsurgency efforts against the leftist FMLN. The United States later supported a 1992 peace accord that ended the 12-year conflict and incorporated the FMLN into the political system. The conservative National Republican Alliance, known as ARENA, maintained control of the presidency from 1989 to 2009, when it was replaced by two consecutive FMLN administrations. Despite periodic tensions, the United States worked productively with these ARENA and FMLN administrations. In 2019, however, popular disaffection with corruption and insecurity under both parties led to the election of outsider Nayib Bukele, and relations between the United States and El Salvador have deteriorated considerably under Bukele's increasingly authoritarian rule. Now, I think it's important to point out, and you kind of alluded to this, the role and the introduction here by the congressional report, it just says the U.S. supported counterinsurgency efforts. Now, yes, are they referring, you mean, to all the guns and weapons and the guerrilla fighters that we supported to basically overturn the rule of law and stability in El Salvador in the 1980s, thus causing the mass exodus of migration, which has showed up at our southern border, which Trump, effectively called, they're bringing thieves, rapists, all that. Is that all, part and parcel with one another?
Thank you, Manila, for walking us back through this important history, which is really the beginning point of any analysis. These wars against Central American revolutionary governments and anti-imperialist governments, it wasn't just in El Salvador. It was in Guatemala. It was in Honduras. And, of course, in Nicaragua. We saw what played out in Panama in 1989 with the U.S.'s Christmas bombing and invasion. So from 1979 to 1992, you have the U.S. proxy war, similar to what the U.S. is doing right now to the tune of $115 billion in Ukraine. Yep. The U.S. Congress pumped money every conceivable way into El Salvador for this proxy war against the Salvadorian leftists, the Salvadorian Marxist guerrillas. Officially, you have 75,000 Salvadorians who were murdered. This was brother against brother. This was the complete cleavage of society. Again, I think similar to the proxy war right now against Russia that's playing out in Ukraine, which is incredibly cruel and traumatic for Ukrainian society. So we can only understand this quote-unquote gang problem if we go back into this historical trauma, especially this recent historical trauma. And on the heels of that, you have this other phenomenon where you have this massive migration to Los Angeles. Your people's currency has been devalued. No jobs are available in the streets of El Salvador. So you have this massive wave of migration to Texas, to Arizona, but particularly to Southern California. And then you have these massive deportations in the early 90s where all these gang suspects and gang members the lumpen proletariat, the most alienated elements of society, the people that Frantz Fanon wrote about. They're thrown back into El Salvador, into this mix, horrific unemployment, no opportunities, no self-esteem, and that's when you have this proliferation of an entire society run by extortionist gangs. So when the United States tries to clean their hands of this problem, it's akin to the abuser who has a track record of abusing children. Hopefully people can follow this analogy. A child molester, an abuser who has a track record of hurting all of these children, and then the children come of age, but no one ever talks about the abuse and the sexual trauma. And what happens to these children? Maybe they become fentanyl addicts, or they're popping oxycodones, or maybe they end up in prison, or maybe they join a gang or what have you. But no one peels back the layers, as Manila has, of this historical trauma. So to understand Bukele and to understand this present moment, we have to go through the trauma left by this 1979 to 1992 U.S. proxy war against the Salvadorian people and against the forces of self-determination.
I'll just point out that I'm from Los Angeles and I'm from the east side of LA. So I saw the 1980s gang wars of basically the Mexican mafias and cartels versus MS-13, and I saw that violence firsthand. I grew up around it. So as a kid, I wanted to know why was this happening around me? I didn't understand, because what I saw as an Asian kid in a Latino community was Latino versus Latino. I didn't understand. So I kind of grew up seeing it, Danny. So I appreciate you breaking that down for us.
Yeah, 100%. If people are interested in this topic, I just wrote a review, actually, of the pioneers, of the precursors to the Crips and the Bloods, who, of course, came out of the Black Power movement and the Black Panthers. There's a great book called Beyond Crips, which goes deep into this, that I just reviewed. People should check out Bastards of the Party. People should check out Black and Gold. I actually teach a lot on gang studies at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. I was mentored by David Brotherton, one of the foremost criminologists on this matter. And I think they're fascinating discussions. Of course, it's the Salvadorian people trapped in this reality. And it's a cruel, cruel reality for the 6.4 million people in this country, a country where some 11% of the population depended on gangs. What the state didn't do, and again, I can't help but go back to my studies and my time in Rio de Janeiro. What the gangs didn't do, what the state couldn't do, the gangs did. If you couldn't access a doctor, you may have had a nephew or a cousin or a neighbor or a compadre who was in a gang who could access the ambulance or the doctor. Mm-hmm. So this Northern Triangle situation is extremely complex, and of course, it's forced more and more people to migrate because they don't see hope surviving in their homeland.
Absolutely. Wow. No way out.
Professor, thank you, man. A fascinating explanation of what's taking place in El Salvador.
You're like the coolest professor out there.
Yeah, I know. Professor Danny Shaw is an international affairs analyst, professor of Latin American studies at CUNY. This is City University of New York. You can follow him on Twitter at Danny Shaw CUNY. You guys are listening to Fault Lines. My name